Today I'm going to give you sort of an insight into the type of work that I look at, thinking about different ways in which women scientists and marginalised scientists are represented on screen, and thinking about the different ways that that is communicated and constructed. So not only thinking about the on-screen representation, but how those new past and imagined pasts of women scientists are seen on screen. So this particular quotation that starts the title of the paper actually comes from a unfortunately quite short-lived science fiction time travel show called Timeless, which ran from 2016 through till 2018. And it is about a series of people who travel through time trying to stop an evil corporation from changing history for their benefit. And it is led by a woman historian and her knowledge of women and marginalised people's contributions across time. So a lot of the stories are built around this idea of finding and locating the people who have been integral to a particular moment in history, who have often been hidden from official histories and stories. So as I surmise, Anglo-American film and television media have begun to offer new screen-specific approaches to visualising women's expertise and hidden histories as central narratives rather than addendums to the stories of great white men of science. This particular show, if you haven't seen it, is really interesting in terms of this space of imagining the position of women and people of colour throughout history. So it has a very diverse cast with women positioned as experts across the cast and throughout the hierarchy of the government and the scientific agency and institute that the series is based in. And this quotation, "We're saving white guys' history, a lot of my history sucks," comes from the black engineer Rufus, who's one of the main cast. And as they are going back in time and trying to stop this evil corporation from changing history, his realization is, and his frustration is, that wherever he goes in history as a black man, he will always be at a disadvantage. Sometimes he finds that an advantage, his invisibility, and the fact that people don't see him allows for him to do some undercover work and sort of move around in a way that a white woman and a white man cannot. But a lot of this narrative structures around why are we saving these particular stories, why are we saving this particular history, that has led to the marginalisation of so many people. I realise I've not put my timer on, so just give me a second. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background on myself and the research that I do, a lot of my research stems from science communication and looking at the intersection specifically of arts and science communication. So I do not have a background in science research. I do not have degrees in science. My degrees are in history and film studies. And after I completed my PhD, which was on Planet of the Apes from 1968, I got involved in a project at Manchester School of Medicine at the University of Manchester, looking at the intersections of medical sciences and entertainment media. From that, I got really interested in women's representation in sciences and that sort of intersection of gender, science and entertainment. I then went on to a postdoc at the University of Newcastle, looking at imagined science futures, which again intersected with the interest that I had with how we imagine the future, how we position marginalised stories and narratives within those particular futures. So I sort of like to give sort of a little bit of a mapping of where my particular research interests come from, and sort of how they kind of connect as well. So I'm going to be thinking about today is how women are represented, who is seen to speak for science, and how this affects audience perceptions about who holds scientific expertise, thinking about media producers and why they often select existing stories of women of science rather than discovering those new or hidden histories of women, and how science-based fictions, and especially those that utilise science fiction narratives, can allow for explorations of unknown, hidden science histories, and can reimagine the processes and the experiences of women and marginalised people within the sciences. So this splits down broadly into a couple of themes that I look at in this particular paper, which is going to be published hopefully within the next couple of months as part of the Palgrave Guide to Women in Science. I think I'm the only major contribution that looks at the arts, science, communication intersection rather than at specific women scientists. So thinking about how women scientists have been annihilated, uncovered, imagined, how they've advised and been involved in the production of the woman scientist, and then concluding on thinking about why it's important to normalise this representation and idea of women as scientists in fiction. So my work is all rooted in this idea of screening science and thinking about how the sciences and the culture of science is represented on screen. So I'm interested in this in terms of screen, page and stage. So I have been in plays about science and science on stage and written about that. I've done projects on science fiction literature and thinking about how different publics engage with the science in science fiction as a way of understanding the ethics, the practices and the policy that is around those particular ideas. And thinking about how an understanding of a particular scientific idea or development of a particular idea can affect the way that policies are made, how people have attitudes to real world scientists, and how future scientists might position themselves within their imagined future as well as the imagined futures of science fiction. So I think about sort of how different, I did a talk at a Star Trek convention. This particular set of images is from a Star Trek convention lecture that I gave, looking at how science and technology has been explored and expressed through Star Trek, thinking about the inspiration for contemporary medical and technological advancements and how those ideas are initially framed and considered often in science fiction, here specifically in the original series of Star Trek. So I use the term science-based fictions rather than science fiction. Often I use SF instead of science fiction because I like to think through this as both science fiction and speculative fiction. And I use science-based fictions to indicate that I'm looking at films that are set in the scientific milieu. So Eva Flicker, who's one of the main scholars looking at women scientists and the representation, talks about fiction films with a scientific theme, which got a bit wordy, especially when you've got a very restricted word count for an article or a chapter. So I went with science-based to mean the same thing. So thinking about the fact that women scientists are not only just found in science fiction, but across different genres. So science fiction, forensic and police procedurals, medical dramas, comedies. They appear in lots of different places. I should add musicals into there as well. Now having looked at a recent musical TV series called Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, which as part of its main cast has 2 women software developers, and they just are those women. That is part of their character. It's not part of their story. They are women of science. There they are. And so it's starting to see them being positioned in different genres where their expertise is not questioned or part of the narrative progression. It just is. So a lot of this is based around David Kirby's ideas of the systems of science. So the idea that science as a cultural narrative found in film and television can be considered in terms of the ways that it represents scientific concepts, scientific expertise, and representations of scientific culture. So I often have to justify why I'm looking at science and entertainment together. I probably didn't need this slide for a talk on science communication to people in the arts science intersection, but it's thinking about science and entertainment as 2 very powerful cultural institutions and ways that people think through and understand the world around them. So thinking about science communication in this respect in relationship to entertainment as a way of thinking about how science shapes the stories that are told, and also how entertainment itself can also influence the sciences. So thinking about, for example, Hidden Figures, how NASA has sort of responded to that particular film and novel in terms of thinking about how they talk about women, how they talk about diversity, recruitment, and these narratives that have always been part of NASA's institutional history, but may not necessarily have been part of the explicit discussion of the science and the scientists that work there. So there are 8 Marie Curie films. One of the very first biopics that came out of Hollywood was a Marie Curie film. I love this XCXTD comic, which is called Zombie Marie Curie, which I use quite a lot in my talks, and also to remind myself why it's important to look for representation and find different representations and ways of engaging with gender and science beyond this idea of Marie Curie as this sort of token, ready-made, recognizable woman scientist. So first film was in 1943, and then in the last couple of years, we've actually had 2 women-directed Marie Curie films. I'm not going to go into my feelings about Radioactive, but you are more than welcome to ask in the questions. So it's thinking about why we have a particular representation of women in science, why it is that we return to particular recognizable figures rather than exploring the histories of women who have not had the exposure and recognition of figures like Marie Curie. So I start off by thinking about annihilation and annihilating women scientists. So that's coming from Gail Tuchman's 1978 work on women in the mass media, and the idea that to be a full member of society, you need to have representation. So to be denied or to be considered unworthy of representation, it is equivalent to symbolic annihilation from that particular culture. So either we misrepresent, or historically we have misrepresented and or ignored women's contributions and expertise in the sciences. So I've got a sort of collection of examples here, 2 good ones or 2 interesting ones and 2 more frustrating ones. So I always get asked why I don't talk more about Big Bang Theory. I can give you some excellent references to people who do talk about it, but it's a bit of a hole in terms of thinking about how those women are represented and how the most interesting representation of a woman scientist, which was Leslie Winkler, who appears in the first series, is sort of removed from that particular narrative in order to maintain male representation of sciences and women being positioned as the pretty Smurfette type character within those particular narratives. So yeah, again, please ask me about Big Bang Theory if you want to, but you'll note that I do not go into a lot of Big Bang Theory in this particular talk. So thinking about the fact that even though we are starting to see an improvement in representation, there is still very much a limited representation of women. You have the sort of Psy Candy, plain brain dichotomy. So women scientists are often these exceptionally sexy and beautiful women who are surprisingly young, or they're framed as sort of plain intelligent women, and there's sort of this split between beauty and intelligence. Or as Alberto Elena argues with reference to representations of Marie Curie, you get the exceptional superwoman, super scientist. And so there is not much nuance in that, a lot of the representation historically of women scientists. So my interest in the representation of women scientists actually came from the film Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, which was the sequel, the second film in the reboot of the Planets of the Apes franchise. And it was the positioning of Kerry Russell, who is an American actress I absolutely adore and have followed her career for a really long time. And I was excited to see that she would be playing a CDC scientist as part of this particular film. And then the only time that she gets to use her or any sort of scientific skill is to help a distressed female ape give birth to a baby ape. She is a virologist, specialist, and in this, her only sort of scientific positioning is as woman and as caretaker. And so I found that very frustrating, and I was sort of interested in seeing where we were seeing an increase in representations of women scientists, but whether these women were there as addendums to male white stories, or whether they were establishing themselves as identifiable, clear representations of science and scientists. So a lot of this surrounds this idea of who is seen to be speaking for science. So myself and Shelley Thompson have done work and are continuing to do work on thinking about the mediation of women scientists, and thinking about how the voice of science has often been gendered as well. So the fact that women often become the human, socialized human face of science, whereas male scientists will often come in to embody a more objective approach to that particular field. So as I argue, these types of stories that are told about women in the sciences become part of the expectations for women entering the field, an expectation of harassment, bullying and gaslighting that may result in their work being ignored or stolen. So we've done lots of narratives where we have started to look at how women experience the sciences, and the sort of reality and the negative portrayal can be as harmful as sort of a limited and lesser portrayal. So thinking about where those stories are told, who speaks for science, and how we're constructing those narratives. So even when women are offered space in screen fictions, intersectionality and diversity is often sidelined, as it is still predominantly white women who are seen to represent science on screen. And I have my absolutely necessary picture of my collection of Funko Pops at the bottom. So I collect women scientists and women related to the sciences in toy form, which usually I have in my office. I've only got a couple of them at the present moment. I've got Shuri, Michael Burnham and Harley Quinzel as psychologist rather than as Harley Quinn, the cartoon character. So even in the age of past due Hidden Figures and Black Panther's Shuri, it remains still very rare to see a Black woman scientist on screen. So this is from an article from an excellent group called Lady Science, who publish and pay for published articles from writers thinking about women in science, representation of women in the sciences, and issues surrounding gender identity and science. If you haven't looked at it, I highly recommend their podcast, their Twitter, and their online magazine. So I did, of course, diligently as a film scholar, start to think about collecting these women, literally in the case of my toys, and also in my research in terms of thinking about where women have been represented fictionally at that intersection of race, gender, and science. And it is a very limited collection with examples like Jensen from Blade, Molly Woods from Extant, and then you've got sort of the two Black engineers from The Expanse and the Cloverfield Paradox. So thinking about where these casting decisions have been made and where science and race has become part of this particular discussion. Let's see if I've ticked the right box for the clip. Oh, the Rainbow Wheel of Death.
My king.
Stop it. Stop it.
I've already sent a car ahead to Busan for you. Who are you taking with you to Korea?
Okoye. And Nakia as well.
You sure it's a good idea to take your ex on a mission?
Yes. We'll be fine. Besides, you'll be on a call should we need backup.
I have great things to show you, brother. Here are your communication devices for Korea. Unlimited range, also equipped with audio surveillance system. Check these out. Remote access Kimoyo beads. Updated to interface directly with my send table.
And what are these?
The real question is, what are those? Why do you have your toes out in my lap?
But you don't like my royal sandals. I wanted to go old school for my first day.
Yeah, I bet the elders loved that. Try them on. Fully automated, like the old American movie Baba used to watch. And I made them completely sound absorbent.
Interesting.
Guess what I call them? Sneakers. Because you... Never mind.
Thank you. So I like to use this particular clip of the introduction of Shuri's lab and the main introduction for that particular character. Although she's appeared in scenes prior to this point, this is her sort of longest scene where she is the focus, and she is automatically and indelibly connected to this lab and this space. It feels like it's something that she would have created and she would have wanted to work in. This beautiful combination of design and practicality, of tradition and technology. I can talk for hours on the production design and mise-en-scène of the lab in Black Panther, but this sort of representation of not only a woman scientist, but a woman scientist who is not adulterated by colonial and socially constructed Western hegemonic femininity and indeed toxic masculinity. So this is an excellent article from Delega from 2018, where she talks about symbolic annihilation in for Black women in science fiction, as well as this representation of Shuri as this scientist who is not bound by structures and systemic racism and sexism that many women scientists have to combat and engage with. There is no discussion here of leaky pipelines or glass ceilings. She, although privileged as the king's sister, has definitely earned her position as this woman scientist, as this very accomplished head of science in this particular country. So then moving on to this idea of uncovering hidden figures, this term which has been circulating in feminist histories and women's histories for a long time, thinking around this idea of how we observe and understand this representation of the female scientists, and the fact that it appears that there are few opportunities for women. If you're looking for role models, if you're looking for representation, that this is quite limited. So why should we be uncovering these particular women's stories, telling these stories of sort of lesser known scientists? So this is a gift from Ammonite, which was I've forgotten the name of the scientist. This is why we label our pictures. But
Mary Anning.
Say it again.
Mary Anning.
Thank you, Mary Anning. Thank you, Shirley, not Mary Anning. So you have Ammonite here as a sort of engagement with her as scientist, but also as queer woman. So we're starting to get more engagements again along intersectional lines in terms of representation, in terms of thinking about how women are related to this sort of idea of science and how science can be expanded as a concept and idea in terms of what constitutes science. So not only do we need more stories about exceptional individual women in science, but also narratives that include women experts as part of a diverse team where gender is not simply a defining narrative or character trait. So why do we want to go beyond Curie, beyond Marie Curie as this representation of women scientists? So there is an excellent project that was called Beyond Curie. I don't know if you can see my video, but I've got a poster in the background from that particular project of Rosalind Franklin which of course is the name of my female cat. And so Beyond Curie looked at the intersection of the arts and representation of sciences, and thinking about how we could promote particular images and knowledge about women scientists, because often when we quoted or looked for an example of a woman scientist over and over and over again, it would be Marie Curie, which was a very limited and feels very old version of what a scientist could be, whereas in fact through this project you see the vibrancy, diversity and age range of scientists that are working and what fields they're working in. Obviously, Hidden Figures has done a huge amount and a huge amount of work in terms of that representation and the idea that a woman-led film about science can be profitable, can be popular, and can have a cultural as well as financial impact. So the adaptation of Hidden Figures, which was done simultaneously with the book being written. So Margot Shetterly, the author of Hidden Figures historical text, sold the rights for the film while she was still completing the book. And so there's a really interesting exchange between her and the female screenwriter in terms of producing both the historical text and the film itself. Yes, it's directed by a white male director, but I still think it is very important in terms of the ways that it starts that conversation about uncovering women scientists. Also behind me is a Hidden Figures poster. I'm very on brand, really. One of my more interesting examples that I've seen recently, where I'm thinking about rather than uncovering, rather imagining women scientists within history, is the example of Aluna Komyuk from the very, very popular series Chernobyl from 2019. She is one of the few characters in the entire series who was entirely made up. And the choice by the writers and director to include this particular character was to recognize that there were women scientists working in Russia at this time, to in part give that sort of human face to this particular science. This is nuclear science. It gives it a more perhaps softer approach, which, yes, problematic, but at the same time, the fact that they chose to include a woman as this sort of voice of science in this very complicated narrative, where understanding the science and seeing the importance of recognizing expertise was such a major component of the success of that narrative, whilst at the same time then being able to answer that question. So every time the director was asked, why did you make up Ulana? What is she there for? He could then respond with, well, actually, there were a lot of women working in medicine and the sciences in Russia at the time, and she is a representation not only of those women, but of the power of science in that period. Also, my interest here comes from Timeless, which is where I started, and thinking about how Timeless as a TV series does some interesting stuff in terms of imagining, rather than imagining new scientists, imagining how those women could be utilized within a narrative, imagining how their expertise and unique contributions could become part of broader narratives and stories. My favorite episode is, of course, the one that is about the space race, and the hidden history which Lucy uncovers and tells us about is that of Katherine Johnson. Now, the TV series was released 1 month almost exactly to when the film was released. So this was sort of the introduction of that particular hidden narrative prior to the release of Hidden Figures. So I always think that's quite interesting that they got there like a month earlier. TV can just get pip in terms of being able to add in those particular characters. So I'm going to show you a clip of Katherine Johnson in action with Rufus, the male engineer, from the main crew of this particular show. She says.
So how long should it take to download?
Around 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
I know. Fast, huh? You better be right about all this. Those guys will be back any minute. I can get into a world of trouble.
I am, just trust me.
Trust you. Maybe you haven't noticed, but it isn't exactly raining black women around here. I've had to prove I belong here every day. Now I'm putting that all on the line for this? For you? That must be crazy.
You're right, I haven't given you any reason to trust me, but I'm asking you to anyway, because the very last thing I'd want to do is let you down.
Why is that?
Honestly, I'm a little starstruck right now. You're one of the reasons I am who I am.
What are you talking about? I'm just a number cruncher in the basement.
Not true. To me, to a lot of people, you're just as important as the guys in Mission Control. Or the ones on the moon.
So it's a little bit schwancy at points in there, but this idea that he gets to go back in time and tell his idol that he appreciates her and that she's part of the reason he gave him that sort of push to become a scientist, to know that Black people had been involved in these major moments of history. I have another point there, but I've forgotten what it was. I'm sure it was very interesting as well. So it's thinking about why Hidden Figures is important, thinking about this disruption of the trends, dramatizing Black women's experiences at an institution that is so often associated with white scientists, white astronauts, white government, and thinking about not only how they were involved in this major pinnacle moment, but thinking about how they were suffused through that particular process as computers, as programmers, as engineers, and as mathematicians. So a lot of their stories and those who have been involved in these moments of history have been lost to great white men and the overarching institutional narratives of NASA. I remember what I was going to say. I was part of a project with a film education group and the British Society for the History of Science. We went around doing screenings and discussions of Hidden Figures. And in one of the events I did as the token white person in a room of schoolgirls of colour from various different working class Manchester schools, alongside a Chinese heritage mathematician and a Nigerian Black woman engineer. And one of the girls asked the question, if you could go back in time, what would you tell the women from Hidden Figures? And Ozu was very excited about this particular question and the fact that if she was to time travel back to Hidden Figures and to meet these women, she would tell them to keep going. And as Rufus does in this particular series, gets to tell those women that they are inspirational and that what they are doing is groundbreaking, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. So as I said, some of my work here is about thinking about how the background of these stories are told, how we create these particular stories. So thinking about who's writing, directing and advising on these particular stories. This is my entire collection of women science advisors that I've found so far, all 4 of them, who have worked on TV and films. If you know any more, please share them. I would be delighted. This is part of a project that I'm developing to look at women scientists' engagement with entertainment media. And I find it fascinating that the 4 examples that I have got are female-led narratives, ones that engaged with not only the science and the science accuracy, but actually thinking about the intersections of gender with those sciences. So Cosima Herta, who becomes the namesake of Cosima Niehaus in Orphan Black, the BBC Canada series. She was involved very early on in the process in terms of creating those characters and how the cloning would intersect with that sort of science fiction narrative. In the case of Anne Simon in The X-Files, she actually contacts the producers of The X-Files within the first series and basically says, please let me help. You need some help in terms of how you're representing medical sciences here. And she was sort of an active contributor in that early development of the X-Files, recognising the role and position that a scientist could bring to that particular production. So when it comes to writing, directing and producing women scientists, we're still very much in a position where a lot of these narratives are being written by cis white men. And so even when you do get these exciting stories like Hidden Figures, you're still not seeing opportunities being given to women writers, women producers, women directors. So we have masculinized and normalized the idea that film production is a male job, that cameramen are cameramen, that best boys are boys, all of these sort of gendered terms that are associated with that do matter. Terminology does matter. In terms of writing, women science fiction writers tend to write more women scientists, thinking about where diversity needs to take place in the media industry in terms of how we change these particular narratives. How do we change the way that we reproduce and reinforce cultural models and cultural responses to the sciences? So one of the ways is thinking about what scientists are involved in creating these narratives, who is represented on screen, as well as my conclusion, which is thinking about this normalization. So one of the books that I found really, really useful as part of the work that I'm doing is actually a book on suffragettes and the First World War and science, written by Patricia Farrer. And the book is very interesting in terms of this history, but her conclusion thinks more broadly about how women have been excluded from the sciences. So she argues that although the explicit rejection and mockery of women as scientists and women's scientific expertise is lessening, there are lots of subtle ways in which not white, straight, able-bodied men feel like outsiders, showing that modern discrimination is elusive, insidious, and stubbornly hard to eradicate. So this comes through things like the refusal and failure to incorporate women and ethnic minority voices into the visual and academic cultures of science, whether that's being who's being interviewed in the newspaper, on a news show, as to who is being promoted into particular roles at universities. The deficit of representations, and especially portraits of women in scientific institutions. So I've done some work with the Royal Society, and they're very proud of the fact that one day they took all of the paintings of male scientists down and put up women for one day, and then they took them back down again. And that there is an exhibition on women scientists in the basement next to the toilets. It's the sort of representation and how these are positioned that you get this sort of like, we did it for that one day, and then not actually thinking about changing that. The absence of women's scholarship in student reading and scholarly reference lists. I'm going to show you my bibliography in a minute, and it is almost exclusively women. So I think I've probably gone to the wrong side there. I've gone a bit extreme in terms of how my reading works in this case. But thinking about how what we read and what we ask our students to read also impacts upon this naturalization and normalization of women as the sort of exception. And this also comes in then in terms of lack of representation, misrepresentation, underrepresentation, or marginalization of women's representation on screen. So what I'm arguing for, and what my work is focused on, is thinking about normalizing women's expertise. So I started off by mentioning Zoe and Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, which is a musical, who has that position. Sorry, Penny's just appeared and I waved. I realized that not everyone else can see her. That in Zoe's Extraordinary Playlist, you have these two major female characters who are involved in engineering and science, and that is part of their characterization. It is not necessarily about them becoming scientists or the difficulties they experience. That's just who they are and what they do. So the normalisation of women's experience, both on and behind the camera, is essential to improving the image of women scientists and shifting cultural perceptions about who can be a scientist and what kind of life a woman scientist can have. This, like attempts to improve women's participation in the sciences, cannot just be about adding more women, but thinking about why so few women are incorporated into these stories in the first place. By not being able to see themselves in the ways in which science is mediated and embedded into contemporary culture, those who are under or not represented can feel like the STEM industries are not a place for them. Improving, increasing and diversifying media representation is only one way of affecting change, but it is an important part of the necessary long-term project to change the sciences in a way that stops constraining people by their race, sexuality, class, ability and gender identity. So in a slight adaptation to the Gina Davis Foundation's catchphrase, if they can see it, they can be it, on the screen. This is my slightly scary references list, which is almost all women, and thank you very much for your time. As Lyle said in my introduction, we have a podcast, do have a listen, and I'm running a project on women who make science fiction. You can find me on my website.